In this lecture, we'll take up the book of Leviticus, exploring its original meaning and also its enduring value. Here's an overview. We'll begin by asking the question in terms of ancient Israel, the original audience. What did they regard as the importance of this book? More specifically, what would be a brief way of expressing what was the aim of these instructions? And next, what benefit would these instructions bring? What gift? We'll briefly summarize them and then reflect on what is the cost for Israel of ignoring these instructions, according to the book itself. Secondly, we'll move from ancient Israel to the church and ask what is the contribution, the importance of Leviticus for the church. And we'll reflect on two elements. First, revealing the character of God, and secondly, helping us to better appreciate what it is that Christ achieved for the human race. Thirdly, we'll ask the question, how can we distinguish between those particular precepts or statutes within Leviticus that are time-bound over against those that are timeless and should benefit and govern our lives today? We'll wrap up with some conclusions. Let's begin then by considering how was Leviticus vital and important for the life, the success, the prosperity of ancient Israel. Before I suggest some points, may I encourage you to pause the video and reflect on this question you see on the screen. What would you say was an overarching aim of these various instructions that we find in the book of Leviticus? In other words, what was God trying to get done? What was he trying to accomplish by delivering these instructions to the Israelite people? Please pause the video and just jot down a few thoughts. If you've had a chance to write down a few thoughts, perhaps you'd be interested to know how some other students have responded to this same question when I introduced this in a class. One of the responses was, here is a body of teaching that instructs the people how they can be near to God. So achieving or enjoying access, close access to God. Another student suggested these are instructions that show how people can become more like God, more godly in their lifestyle, such as how to behave towards other people, exhibiting the attitudes of God. Another suggestion was that the book of Leviticus provides house rules for living in God's house. And a thought here is that if a person is a human guest of another human being, a member of the community, when you're in that person's house, you abide by their house rules. Similarly here, we see God saying, if you're going to be in my community, on my estate, here are rules for behaving in my, when I am the host, when it's my house that you're visiting. Another suggestion was that in Leviticus, we have interest in showing distinctions, in particular, how the Israelite people were to be distinct from other people. And that's, we can certainly see the validity of that observation, can't we? And it reminds me of something that you may recall, a very, very profound insight that Moses articulated during the Golden Calf Rebellion, when he said, how is it that we should be any different than other people unless you, the holy God, the Creator, were to accompany us? You can see here those words in Exodus 33, verse 15 and 16, in particular the end of 16. In this way, that is, by virtue of you being immediately present with us, we, Israel, will be distinct, I and your people, from every people on the face of the earth. Another suggestion by one of the students was that the book of Leviticus shows us what is holy And how does that apply to individual lives and to our life as a community seeking to follow God? And finally, another said, Leviticus is about achieving a healthy community. I wonder where your insights regarding the aim of the book of Leviticus fell with regard to some of these other insights. Let me suggest some thoughts that have occurred to me in this regard. I resonate very strongly with the suggestion of one student who initially said, this book teaches people how they can be near to God. I think this is a very, very important overarching aim. For without Leviticus, the people of Israel would not have known how to live in close proximity with God and His holiness. In particular, sin and impurity, and those are not always the same. Sin and impurity among the people would at least bar them from His presence, keep them at arm's length, exclude them. And at worst, if God were to come near to the people as they were sinful and impure, this could evoke a purification by fire. Recall, for example, the tragedy of Nadab and Abihu in their actions in the sanctuary vicinity in chapter 10. They engaged in what was unholy, using this strange fire, and admittedly we're not entirely sure what that was, but whatever it was a rebellious, a prohibited activity. And they, being so close to the immediate presence of God, encountered a combustion, encountered just an immediate reaction. What they brought could not be that close to God, and so it cost them their lives. So in order for Israel to be able to endure the immense goodness of God's presence, then they needed to know, and now we're at item A, subpoint 1, they needed to know what was impure and what was unholy. Right now I'm using those roughly synonymous, although they are certainly distinct. But both of those qualities were features that would create problems and prevent Israel from being in the richest immediate presence of God. So they needed to know what was forbidden, what was going to be harmful. They needed to know also how to resolve their distance from God if impurity or unholiness should come into their lives. So what was it that would keep them away from God's presence? And if they engaged in that, how could they fix it? And now let's consider, why is it that cleanliness, and even more so, holiness, was so important? Turn for a moment to the end of the book, chapter 26, and let's take a look at what was God's aim. Here we see Leviticus 26, and particularly the passage from verses 3 through 13 I'm interested in. Leviticus 26 contains the blessings and the curses. So the penalties you see on the bottom screen, the editor's section title, penalties for disobedience. That's the curses section if people disobey. But notice the blessings. Notice what God is doing, everything within His divine power to provide for Israel. Verse 3, if you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will give you, look what God wants to do, rains in their season. Have you heard of parts of the world events where rain has been withheld? There's been a drought. It's just devastating. Verse 4, or 5 rather, your threshing shall overtake the vintage. And what this indicates is that the harvest of grain will be so abundant that it would last longer than usual. The time required to engage the harvest, to complete the harvest, would go far past the normal boundaries of the calendar, all the way to the time when they need to hurry up and start gathering the grapes. That same concept is expressed down in verse 10. Verse 10, you shall eat old grain long stored. All right, this is saying you have a backlog of grain that you've set aside from the last harvest to carry you through the winter. And then it says you'll have to clear out the old while you still have it to make way for the new. You will not even exhaust last year's supply of grain before you have to push it aside and make room for the new. There will be such an abundance of agricultural blessing. Not only is that true, but now dialing back to verse 6, peace in the land. If you're familiar with some of Israel's history, they did not always enjoy peace. There were periods when surrounding nations were breathing down their neck and invading and capturing them. Peace in the land is just an enormous blessing. You will lie down, none will make you afraid. How good is that? And then notice verses 11 and 12 in particular. And as we reach the close of this list of blessings, we're reaching more and more valuable provisions from God. Verse 11, I, says the Creator God, will place my dwelling in your midst. I will be right there with you. This is what Moses clung to, what he would not let God give up on back in Exodus 33. If your presence is not with us, this is the design of God in bringing the people out of Egypt. He set them down at Sinai, as you recall, in Exodus 19 to 24, and said, are you serious about being my people? Here's what it takes. The Decalogue is there in Exodus 20. They said, yes, we want to be your people. And immediately in chapter 25, he says, here's how to build me a house so I can live in your neighborhood. I want to be among you. This is reinforced again now in verse 11 of Leviticus 26. The best of the blessings is this, that God is going to be on site. And notice that second half, I will not abhor you. That is to say, you, the nation, will be of a quality of purity that I will have no objection. I will be able to embrace you. Verse 12, I will walk among you. Can you see the emphasis of God's sustained presence and communion and fellowship? This is the Garden of Eden gone right again, restored. And he wraps it up with this phrase in 12b, I'll be your God, and you'll be my people. I can't help but think that when the later prophets, and here I'm thinking of ones like Jeremiah, or not so late as that, Hosea, Jeremiah ministering to the southern kingdom, Hosea to the northern kingdom, they will say that God's relationship with Israel was like a husband with a wife, of committed, rich relationship, and exclusive. Like a husband would say, I'm yours, and the wife would say, and I belong to you. Exclusive, mutual exclusivity. I think this is some of the tone that we should hear in verse 12, what otherwise may seem to us rather cold and abstract language. But God says, I will be your God. This is like a husband saying, I am yours alone, and you will be my people. The wife saying, I'm yours alone. And then 13 reiterates what God has done for them. This is my history. This is my track record. I'm the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be slaves no more. I've given you freedom, broken the bars of your yoke. And isn't this a beautiful picture of a physical posture that conveys freedom? I made you walk erect. You don't have to bow down over the heavy burdens of the slave master. You're set free. the relationship of Israel with God, while they are serving Him, they are His servants. They are not subjected to servile, demeaning relationship. God exalts them. God exalts them and lifts them up to the true character that He intended as His creation. Now, the reason we're looking to the end of Leviticus right now, bear in mind the frame of reference for examining this is to respond to the question, what is God's aim in Leviticus? He's showing them how to live so that they can lay hold of the very best of the best of blessings, the very most prosperous of prosperity, which is to live in closest, immediate association, community, fellowship, and friendship with God Himself. This is what we're trying to convey under point number 3. Cleanliness and holiness is so important because those were necessary prerequisites, qualities, if Israel is to receive the very best that God wants to give them, which is His own immediate presence. Chapter 15, verse 31 underscores this too. Here at the top of the screen you see Leviticus 15:31. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness. Why? So they do not die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle. And notice this, my tabernacle that is in their midst. My tabernacle, where I live, my dwelling, is right among them. That is what God is, we could say, insistent on giving to Israel. But in order for that to happen, they must be careful to not defile it. That is the prerequisite for getting close to God. And as indicated on the screen, then in order to enjoy closest, immediate, non-mediated, non-interfered or insulated presence of God, then holiness must be what Israel participates in. They must become holy. And you see on the screen towards the bottom, be holy for I am holy. Several passages, several times this is repeated. And Peter will pick this up in his first letter. Already we've referred to the tragic rebellion or disobedience of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, and how as they were right there in the immediate presence of God, but dared to behave in an unholy fashion, using this strange, this foreign fire for their offering, they illustrated in a tragic way that the holy presence of God was not survivable by us if we choose to try and bring our own way of doing things, what we think is best or convenient, into God's presence. So if the aim of these instructions, the aim was to teach Israel how to live so that they could enjoy the immediate ultimate goodness of God's presence, what might we say was the gift? And admittedly, God's presence is the gift. But from another angle, what were some of the benefits of these instructions for ancient Israel? I'd like to suggest that what God was trying to give Israel here was a way into health, and health that was not just one-dimensional, but multidimensional, holistic health. And so there are 4 sub-categories that I've suggested here. I invite you to consider these. Some of the principles, the laws and statutes that we find in Leviticus provided health for the physical body. We call this hygiene on various levels. And it was for individuals, but already some of this, you'll see, will benefit the community, which is point number 4 below. So these subpoints are intended just as a few samples, by no means exhaustive. For example, here's one, a rather minute piece, but it indicates God was trying to give his people health on a physical level. Consider circumcision. Now, circumcision is not original in Leviticus. We encountered that back in Genesis, when God was saying to Abraham, a sign of my covenant with you will be a circumcision of the males. I'm noticing here, drawing our attention to the fact that God said this should be done with infants on the 8th day. Biologists and physicians have examined what happens in a baby's ability to clot blood, that is, to heal after a surgery or a wound. On the 8th day, the clotting factors within the blood of the infant spike. They are stronger, more able, better able to clot, to heal from a wound on the 8th day. And I believe it continues after that. But prior to that, such a surgery would be more hazardous. This to me is just a beautiful little example of God saying, all right, circumcision is something I need you to do, and I'm going to show you how to do it, when to do it, so that the infant will have the best chance at health through this process. I am sure, as you were reading over Leviticus, passages such as in 13, verse 4 is one example where God says, if it looks like someone has a skin disease or some kind of illness, we need to quarantine them, put them in isolation for a period of time. I'm not exactly sure when modern medicine began to realize that this is so important, the idea that diseases could be communicated by proximity, and if we would just isolate people with severe diseases, we could protect other parts of the population. Here it is, as early as Leviticus, God is gifting to the people edicts which will greatly enhance their health. Consider in the same vein the prohibitions against illicit sex in chapters 18 and 20. How many sexual diseases would just dry up and go away if our modern society would observe sexual purity and not create an opportunity for these to be transmitted. And incidentally, those prohibitions in sexual relations, those confines that God painted, the boundary lines that he painted, those do not reflect the way the surrounding nations were behaving. The illicit sex was common in the surrounding nations. So Israel was distinct in this regard, and it was a gift for health of a physical sort. Next, I believe that some of what we have in Leviticus is providing health of a mental or a psychological sort. And as one example, I'd like us to think about the emotional health of children when there are the boundaries, particularly the boundaries of sexual purity among adults, among parents. So, for example, now we'll turn it on its head and think of it negatively. Children wondering who their parents are. Even in wholesome situations where a child's awareness of their biological parent has been curtained off or veiled. And I'm thinking now about adopted children. In past years, it's been customary to keep a child from learning who was their parent, who had to give up their child for adoption. It was thought that somehow that it was important to veil, to curtain off that source of information. Now, more recently, as children are growing up, adopted children are growing up, they're wondering. And they're wondering to the point of saying, please, you've got to open those records. And now our society in the United States is more permissive, more liberal and willing to let inquiring children learn who their parents are. And some adoptions, as I'm sure you're aware, open adoptions are such that the child knows their biological parent early on. They even have visits and things of this sort. All this pointing to a psychological need of a child to know, who brought me into this world? Who am I connected to? What is my identity? Now, imagine if all the boundaries of sexual activity, and here we're thinking procreative activity, if all the boundaries are removed. Now, surely a child who's raised by the person that gave him or her birth, the child knows who their mother is. And here I'm imagining, now we're not talking about adoption, but we're talking about the child growing up. The mother raises her child, but who is the father? Well, I don't know who your father was. You know, I had relations with a lot of men. I'm just imagining what the mother who is erased all boundaries of exclusive sexual relationship, of husband and wife relations. She's erased those boundaries. I don't know, my child, who your father was. What does that do for the child? There's got to be an enormous hollowness, the sense that I don't have the balancing security of knowing who father and mother are. I know who my mother is, but who's my father? Another level of health of the mind, and still I'm staying with the idea of security of children, has to do with the prohibition against incest. Psychologists who work and counselors who work with children who have been molested make it plain to us that the damage done to a child who has been sexually violated is just staggering. Now on the other side, right? This is the evidence that we have from counselors. Let me enlarge on that a bit more. We hear indications that not only do they have memories that are painful, but in terms of emotional development, it's as though they've been paralyzed. There can be an arrested development, and evidently even at times physical development is arrested. How can we compare this, since it's such an invisible wound? Physically, it's an invisible wound. Perhaps it would help us in analogy to think of it like an amputation. What if a young child who's been sexually molested, if suddenly an arm were torn off, we would say, don't do that. This is horrific, to go through life with only one arm. And yet, if somehow we could actually somehow see their psyche, we would see their being basically dismembered by this horrific violation. This is what psychologists and counselors are telling us. And God steps in chapters 18 and 20 and said, don't do that. That totally must not be done. And yet we know it, even in our society, in the modern age, this carries on in hidden ways to an alarming extent. So we're saying that these prohibitions and these strictures that are issued in Leviticus, while on an initial read, so many of them seem foreign and, may I say, useless, pointless, just external ceremony that severely undersells and misrepresents what God is trying to give, the gift he's trying to give to this society, this nation, in terms of health of the mind. Now that's just one sample of what God is doing in terms of health of the mind through the regulations within Leviticus. Next, let's look at health of the soul. Health of the soul. if Israel pays attention to the confines, to the narrowness of the way of living here within Leviticus, they will live a life of singular devotion to God, a life marked by fidelity to Him. It's at this point that we can become more aware of the contribution, the gift of some of the laws that today seem quite obscure, quite obscure. For example, here's one in chapter 19, verse 27. There's a prohibition against certain hairstyles, rounding of the hair, marring of the beard. Understandably, we look at this and say, what's that about? We don't see anything related to character or moral formation. What's this about? As scholars examine this, they discover that these particular styles of grooming indicated alliance with a theology that was dead set against sole devotion to the God of Israel. The original audience would have recognized this particular grooming as an activity of worshiping the dead. It's related to mourning death, and we know that certain actions accompanied acceptable Israelite mourning. We know at times they would tear parts of their garments, put dust on their heads. Sometimes they would have other ways of expressing grief. But the one that's prohibited here, cutting the hair in a certain fashion, was one that was associated in other nations with worshiping the dead. And God is saying, you don't do that. I am the one that you worship. Some of the other prohibitions are more obviously barring Israel from engaging in worship or spiritual allegiance activities with false gods. Think, for example, of the prohibition against worshiping Molech, the god Molech. Chapter 18, verse 21. Now, this is coupled with killing children, sacrificing children. And initially, our consciousness would go to the child sacrifice and say, that's murder, that's wrong. And absolutely, that's correct. The other half of that, which made this wrong, was that it was worship of Molech. He was the god. That was the god supposedly calling for child sacrifice. God is saying, you worship me, and never should you sacrifice your children. 1926 is an edict against witchcraft. Again, looking for supernatural alliances. Israel was prohibited from looking for supernatural alliances that would divide their devotion to God, looking for ways to manipulate life through supernatural powers. And God says, I'm the only one that you are to be devoted to. So this is what we have in mind by saying these laws led Israel they were a gift to Israel to bring about health of the soul. And the way that soul is healthy is by spiritual fidelity. Later prophets would call failure of spiritual fidelity spiritual adultery. Once again, painting in vivid terms how deep is our devotion to God, how deep is the union with God, that He's creating the fellowship, His living among us, and consequently how painful it is when we get involved with worship of others, or somehow elevate someone or something else in our frame of reference in our life to compete with or be superior to our love and devotion to God. The last dimension of health that I would suggest that you recognize as being a gift of Leviticus is health of the community. Some of the features we've already talked about, such as quarantine against infectious diseases and so forth, these contribute health on a communal level. as well as those that we'll consider here. But add to that, love of neighbor as self. Who among us does not like to be around someone marked by generosity and selflessness? This just richly strengthens the bonds of a community, makes it a healthy place. In contrast, what's it like when that's absent? Well, if we're not loving our neighbor as self, we're loving ourselves more than neighbors, and that means that we are a drain. We're drawing off. There's just a steady drip, pulling away from the life of those around us as we draw it into ourselves selfishly. Instead, contributing to others, making community healthier as a result. The year of Jubilee marks the last two bullets on this page, where we see that God says, I want community to be healthy because on a routine, predictable basis, every 50th year, those who have come into slavery, and some of this would be voluntary, say if they have come across hard economic times, they may sell themselves to be slaves or servants for a period of time, to be under someone else's household, to have employment, and to subject themselves to the restrictions that go with that. And God says, well, if that has to be for a while, okay, but let's make sure that's not permanent. So every time the 50th year rolls around, the doors go open and people go free. If your master, it doesn't matter if your master has come across good times and feels like he can get along without you, or bad times and would never want to let you go, that does not matter. I'm saying you go free. What beautiful health and community this would produce. And consider the last one. The bonds of financial debts canceled every 50th year, the year of Jubilee. And if that may have involved having to sell off ancestral lands, your fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers' farm or house or something like that, because you were in debt, when you come to that 50th year, those revert to the original owner. This is just enormous economic health, a reset every 50th year. This is how God wanted it to be for Israel, if they would be willing to live by the instructions of Leviticus. Next, summary of instructions. It may be valuable to see how Jesus compressed all these instructions into two. When he was asked, what's the greatest command? And he responded not with one, but with two. Love God with everything you have and are. And this is the Shema in Deuteronomy. Here you see it on the screen about the middle of the page. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is the Lord alone, reads in NRSV. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Now, admittedly, this is Deuteronomy. I'm suggesting that this subsumes the thrust of so much of Leviticus. Although the language of loving God, we do not find this in Leviticus. As we hear the message of Leviticus saying, your devotion must be to God alone and to no one else. That's paraphrased, shall we say, rephrased here in the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, of Deuteronomy 6. Loving the Lord your God with all your heart. That means no one else, no love for Molech, no devotion to worship of the dead or any of those other practices of the nations around you, but sole devotion to God. And could we not subsume all of the instructions for how to treat one's neighbor as a way of saying, love your neighbor as yourself? And those words do come from Leviticus, both in chapter 19, verse 18, and similarly in verse 34, where he says, love the foreigner as yourself. Our last point under the heading, what was the importance of Leviticus for ancient Israel, is this. to convey to Israel what would be the high cost if instead they chose to disregard the instructions God was giving them. The high cost was this: if they said, God, we're not interested in these, we're going a different direction, God warned them ahead of time that their period of habitation in the promised land would then, the clock would be ticking down, and there would be a time when they would be spewed out of the land. The language is vivid, isn't it? You would be vomited out of the land. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here we see it on the left, verses 24 through 28. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways. Incidentally, what are the ways? Here in chapter 18 is where we find the concentration predominantly of prohibitions against sexual impurity. Sexual impurity of various sorts: incest, homosexuality, bestiality. These are the main ones. Also, as you see at the top of the page, sacrificing children to Molech. Is in particular, if you engage in those activities, then be warned. Verse 24, I am right now casting out before you those other nations that have engaged in those activities. They've defiled themselves. The land is vomiting them out because of doing it. I'm letting you come in, but if you imitate them and engage in those same activities, verse 28, the land will vomit you out for defiling it, just like it vomited out the nation that was before you. It's as if the land which belongs to God, that's vital to understand. God created it, it's His territory, the whole cosmos. And in alliance with God, it's as if the land has a personality, isn't it? And if the land discovers that those who are living in it are behaving in a objectionable, the language here is abomination, the language is defiling, then it's as if the land gets sick to its stomach. You know what? You've had the experience of something going sour in your stomach to finally the stomach takes over and says, this has got to come out. If I keep this in me any longer, I get sicker and sicker. I've got to expel this. And so it's as if the land is convulsing and reflexively just spews out the sickness of the conduct of the people who preceded Israel in Canaan. And God says, that land is going to do the same to you if you make it sick by activities that make me sick. God does not play favorites. That's an important point here. God does not play favorites. It's not as though He's giving Israel a free ticket as the chosen people. How did this play out? Spin forward in the history of Israel. And sadly, when we come to 721, we find the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital in Samaria. God allows the Assyrian Empire to come in and squash them, and there's the first exile, the fall of the northern kingdom. What is it, about 150 years later, we reel forward to 586, and southern Israel has persisted in just severely disappointing God and saying, we don't want to live like you're telling us to live, despite the various prophets. Finally, Jeremiah comes to him with that difficult ministry of confrontation, and they say, we're not interested. And God says, if you're not interested in me, I'm going to have to give you what you want, what you're crying for, which is a life without me. And you are no longer eligible to live in this land, even though you're the chosen people. So He allows the Babylonians to come in and ransack the land and carry off prisoners into Babylon. So Israel is warned early on of the high cost of disregarding these instructions. Incidentally, while we're on the topic of the exile as the predicted consequence of disregarding these instructions, Did you notice that there's mercy built right into that eventuality as well? Here we can see Leviticus 26. We were at 26 early on in the lecture, weren't we? Particularly the first 13 verses that talk about the immense good that God wants to bring to Israel if they will but abide by these laws. Now we're still in 26. We're in 26 again, and we're seeing what happens if Israel disregards. And what happens if Israel disregards the verses that are not displayed right here is that great tragedy and exile will come to them. Now at 26:40 is where God offers a ray of hope even then in exile. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their ancestors, and that they committed treachery against me. Boy, isn't that vivid language. Disobedience is not just casual, like I'm not interested in God today. God says that's treacherous behavior. Moreover, they continued hostile to me, so that I in turn continued hostile to them, brought them into the land of their enemies, that's exile. If then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, they make amends for their iniquity. 42, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, my covenant with Isaac, my covenant with Abraham. Interesting how that backs up in time, reverse chronological direction. I will remember the land. 43 says the land will have a period of rest that it deserved and denied. 44, yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies in exile, I will not spurn them. God promises not to abandon them, to utterly destroy them. 45, I will remember in their favor the covenant. So God is promising here that even though they may not have the means of sacrifice, and they will not, because in exile there is no temple. If there's no temple, then the sacrifices of contrition, expiation, the sin and guilt offerings cannot be offered. You can't do that in Babylon. You've got to be in Jerusalem. You've got to have a temple. So even though those ceremonies cannot be enacted, God says in verse 40, if they confess their iniquity and admit what they've done wrong, then God says, I will remember the covenant. That means I will, doesn't just remember, God says, it doesn't simply mean that God says, oh, I remember I had a covenant with them at one time. Here, for God to remember the covenant means I make good on it. I deliver on the covenant. I awaken again and enact again, activate that agreement with those ancestors. I will not abandon them. So here is mercy, even on the heels of the punishment, the consequences of abandoning God. This wraps up our exploration of what was the importance of Leviticus for ancient Israel. Next, we'll move on and explore what's the value, the contribution of Leviticus for the church today.